Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Friday Night Drive podcast. This is Josh Welge. I'm here with Steve Soucie. And as we tape here on Wednesday afternoon, we are 2 days away from the first Football Friday. And Steve, I know you're as excited as I am. It's funny, during the course of the year, we get kind of a countdown from our friend and in the business, Edgy Tim. And when we're around Christmas and we're at 300 days away from first Football Friday, I kind of chuckle a little bit, but when we get into single digits, it gets a little bit serious. I've read quite a bit about a lot of teams, and now I want to find out a little bit more about them. How are you feeling as we go into this week?
I'm ready to go. I mean, obviously, there's a slow trickle of games tomorrow on Thursday, and then we really get into the action on Friday. And this is always kind of the hardest time for me to get through because we've been talking about it for a while now, 2-3 weeks of, active preview stories and all this other stuff. But there's still so many questions and so much information that I'm hoping to glean from week one. And we're right on the cusp of it, but we're just not quite there. So the anticipation for me in particular is pretty high.
And we've talked about it before. Week one is a week that we learned so much about teams that we think we might know about, but we don't know until we see them live and on field and get some of that data, as you say. And this year, I think we're going to learn a little bit more about some teams because some teams have really gone out and tested themselves in week one. In some cases, maybe they wanted to. In some cases, maybe they had to. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
I felt like this year it was a situation where, even as late as like March and April, there were a lot of teams out there that had not scheduled games in their non-conference schedule. Whether it be week one or week two, or maybe in some cases a week 3 game. And, that always happens. There's always a few programs that maybe for whatever reason haven't been able to quite line up a game. But the list seemed longer this year, and there was a common thread inside of it. A lot of them were the power programs that we're used to seeing at the top of preseason polls and all these other things. And I think the common thread came through because it was like, a lot of teams, like you said, some are looking for opportunities to challenge themselves. Others maybe don't want to take on that challenge for fear that it might end up messing up their opportunity to get into the playoffs. So the list of opponents for those quality, those upper echelons programs really shrink down. And eventually they kind of reach the point where it was like, we're going to have to play each other, or we're going to have to schedule somebody 4 states over or whatever, just to fill these voids on our schedule. So what it led to is a week 1 and also a week 2 where we've got a lot of games between programs that we expect to be very, very high in the grand scheme of things over the course of the regular season. So a lot of marquee non-conference matchups to kick off the season. We saw it last year. We're seeing it again this year. And I think that's been expanded upon too.
Yeah, you looked ahead to a lot of those this week. And if people are tuning in on Wednesday, Steve dropped his, week 1 games to watch, a list of games around the state that he's really keeping an eye on. Go to FridayNightDrive.com. We have a lot of content going. We have Steve's preseason playoff projections. We have our preseason power rankings. It's Wednesday. We'll have previews up of all the games in all of our markets across Northern Illinois. They'll be going up by Thursday morning. But yeah, let's drill down into a few of these matchups. The one that really jumps off the page, Loyola going down to Illinois State. They know that place very well, and they're going to be playing East St. Louis and on Saturday night. That's a matchup that I know you're really excited about, and I'm really excited to see how those two fare when they get together. I mean, Loyola is a team coming off of winning the 8A state championship. A lot of talent back, a lot of Division I talent back, and East St. Louis, I don't think I know quite as much about this year than maybe in years past, but what are you thinking about that matchup?
It's very interesting. I mean, last year we started in a somewhat similar fashion with East St. Louis playing Mount Carmel in that game, and I went down there for that game, and everybody's excited about the start of the season, and that was a good way to kick off the year. I'm glad that they tweaked the matchup a little bit, but I'm glad that they're going to keep this going. It's my hope that maybe eventually we can maybe expand that into a 2 or a 3 game outing, to be completely honest with you. Maybe put a small school marquee matchup on in the afternoon or something like that. But I haven't really heard anything about that, but I think that would be wonderful if they had an opportunity to do that. But two programs here that obviously have high expectations and expect to find themselves probably back at ISU in late November. Loyola has a lot coming back, starting with quarterback Ryan Fitzgerald, but they did graduate quite a bit. But the one thing about that program, they're going to reload. They have a massive roster. They often have kids that maybe were backups or even third stringers that would be heavy contributors on other programs. That's how deep Loyola tends to be on a year-to-year basis. East St. Louis, a little bit more of an unknown coming into this season, but you can't doubt the talent that program puts out on a year-to-year basis. Different quarterback this year. We got a little look at him in the state final last year, but having a guy like Pops Battle is a stabilizer. Well, he's gone now. So East St. Louis will have to answer some questions about, how they're going to move the football offensively, but there's no doubting that they still have a lot of weapons on that team, particularly on defense. Couple of great linebackers in there, some good secondary players. This is a team that backs away from no one. Like I mentioned before, they're playing three teams that I believe are ranked in the national top 75 outside of this game, not even including the Loyola games. So this is a team that doesn't back down from anything, and they might end up going into the playoffs with a 6-3 or a 5-4 record, but are an absolute dangerous team in any capacity. So should be a fun way to kick off the year.
I'm getting back to what you said off the top about maybe making this a multi-game extravaganza, maybe get a small school involved. I like that idea. I mean, I think you see that in some other states, sometimes on a national level where, you get on ESPN, some of these teams from across the country, you get together for sort of a marathon, an extravaganza of football. Let's get on that. I kind of like that. Let's get our heads together and get on that. But anyway, in the meantime, you mentioned quarterback with Pop's Battle, moving on. I think the one program that in the offseason got as much attention as anyone was Lincoln Way East, bringing in with Jonas Williams transferring from Bolingbrook. A lot of anticipation there to see how he fits into what they do, because they do a lot of things very well, and he does a lot of things very well. And they play Maine South right off the jump, and that's a matchup that, if I'm not mistaken, might be one of those that, hey, they're looking for teams to play, and here they are.
Yeah, this was one of those games that it took fairly long to get into into the spring before it was on the books. And I remember talking to Lincoln Way East coach Rob Zvonar about this before they had the games booked. And he was like, well, it's not official yet. You don't want to jump the gun on these things, but he had said that it was Maine South. And for Lincoln Way East, the way things have developed, currently they don't have a week 2 game. So they actually were scheduled to play a team out of Florida at the East St. Louis Jamboree, and that team backed out of the game. So right now, Lincoln Way East is looking at a situation where they get to open up against Maine South, a high-quality opponent, and unless things change rather quickly, then they're off next week. So I'm sure they're chomping at the bit to get this game in, and then we'll have to cool their jets a little bit before getting back into the fray on week 3.
Yeah, there's more than one team, if I'm not mistaken, that still has some open dates that they didn't think. I mean, I think IC Catholic Prep was able to find a week 1 game. If I'm not mistaken, they're still looking for week 2.
I think so. The last I had heard, there was an issue with that school having signed the contract to come play them. So I don't know if that has been resolved, but as of recently, the only game that they seemed to be searching for was the week 1 game, which they did fill with St. Mary's out of St. Louis, a pretty solid program down that way, that also had an opponent basically back out on them. So that week 1 thing was resolved. We've had a couple of interesting situations with a few teams that have announced that they're not going to carry on with regular seasons, and some of those conferences have done a pretty good job of linking up with one another to create some non-conference games in those vacancies. I think the most interesting one to me was Byron and Williamsville, a couple of strong 3A programs, are playing in week 3 this year because of one member of each of their conferences decided that they weren't going to be able to continue with varsity football, left them both week 3 vacancies. So they linked up and they're playing in Williamsville. So that was like I described it at the time. That's one way to take a batch of lemons that you've been given and make a real tasty batch of lemonade. So That's a good resolution to a bad situation, in my opinion.
I was gonna say, no doubt, and definitely that is definitely making the best out of a bad situation when you get teams like Byron and Williamsville getting together on the football field. Steve, towards the end of last year, as we went into the playoffs, one of the big kind of storylines was a number of 4 and 5 teams that were able to qualify for the playoffs for just the way I'd say math works. Most notably was Nazareth. They started the season 0-4. I believe, if not mistaken, the year after they started the season 2-4 and won the state championship. They started 0-4. They get in the playoffs at 5-4, and then they go all the way to the state championship. They beat Joliet Catholic again. They rallied from behind because that's what they did last year. But they start. I'm sure they don't want to repeat that scenario, but boy, they right off the bat getting Kankakee coming to there, and that's been kind of a nice little game that's developed the last few years in a non-conference setting. And then of course Kankakee, there was a really kind of unusual game a couple years ago. It was a 2-0 final, and then Kankakee beat them last year. I know a lot about Nazareth, but what do you think about that matchup?
Like you said, it has become kind of an interesting little situation for them. I was at the Kankakee Nazareth game last year, and to be honest with you, I thought Nazareth would be able to handle that game pretty convincingly, and that was not the case. Kankakee played very well and beat them. Nazareth, like you said, doesn't want to put themselves in that situation where they have to dig out of the hole. But kudos to them for playing the non-conference schedule that they do. They play Kankakee. Week 2 they play Kenwood, and then week 3 they're not even in conference play yet. But their crossover game is a little team you might have heard of, Mount Carmel. So I mean, they open up so strong in that schedule. And another thing, and I was talking with one of our colleagues, Michael Dwojak, about this earlier this offseason. Some of these Catholic League conferences are so stacked that you can literally look at them before the season based on what you know and stack the 4 teams in any order and make a justification for it. And I think that's especially true in Nazareth's conference, which with the realignment includes St. Rita, IC Catholic, Nazareth, and Wheaton St. Francis. And I mean, you look at those teams on paper, and they all look like the kind of teams that can potentially make deep postseason runs in the classifications that they're in. And you could legitimately, in my mind's eye, stack them anyway as a conference projection at the beginning of the year. And I think that's not the only league in the Catholic League where you can do that. So once you get into Catholic League play, after potentially playing a difficult non-conference schedule, I think we're going to find a lot of teams where we're getting down to week 9 where they're sitting there at 4-4, playing another strong team that, they need to get that 5th win, but their schedule has been so strong that if we do indeed have 4-win teams get back into the playoffs, and I actually think we're going to have more of them this year for a couple of different reasons, those teams are going to be excellently positioned as 4-win teams like Nazareth was last year to be one of those teams, because they're going to have a ton of playoff points because of this extremely complicated and difficult schedule that most of them are undertaking.
You kind of read my mind, because I was going to ask just your early sense as we stand here on August 28th of 4 and 5. Is that a new normal that at least in the short term we should be looking forward to, or what's your sense at it right now?
Well, there are a couple of things that factor into it. I mean, when you start to think about just the general math of things, for years and years and years, we had at least, low 500 teams participating in the IHSA playoff system. Now, after a couple of early season defections, that number's down to 493. So if you do just simple math, more than half of the teams that participate in IHSA football are going to make the playoffs. We need 256 to fill the common fields right now. So we're actually well under that. We're almost at like 52, 53% of the teams are going to get in. Well, just doing the simple win-loss formula, you almost have to have 4 and 5 teams unless something quirky happens where every team that plays an out-of-state team wins. Every team that plays a non-qualifying team in Illinois, they win all those games. That would really be the only way that we would get all 5-win teams in the playoffs with no 4-win teams. That's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. So simple math says it's going to happen. It's just a matter of how many. And then you take the added layer on with the fact that the Chicago Public League has once again changed the way that they're going to send teams into the playoffs. They've made little tweaks and other tweaks like this. Some of the middle divisions in the CPL, which are known as the white divisions, there are certain conferences in the CPL where only the winner of that conference will qualify for the playoffs. In the past, those conferences would produce maybe as many as 3 or 4 teams that would get into the qualification system. Now it's only going to be 1. So I think last year, I believe we had 25 teams from the Chicago Public League qualify. I think that number could drop to as few as 15 or 16. So based on these changes. So those two things combined, the dwindling number of programs, the number of CPL qualifiers that we're likely to have, I'd be absolutely stunned if we didn't have some 4-win teams get in. And if you'd put me on the spot right now, I'll tell you, I think it's going to be a double-digit number of 4-win teams that gets into the playoffs. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 would be my anticipation at this point in time.
Yeah, well, that certainly changes that dynamics of as we're looking through the course of the season of where each individual team is and what their path is. When their path looks a little bit different when they're looking. I mean, we forever it feels like we've said, all right, we need to get to 5, drive for 5, and now that's. I mean, I think most teams probably are still thinking like that. I recall last year I covered Yorkville and Plainfield North. Plainfield North lost their week 9 game to go to 4 and 5, and their post game afterwards, it was like there was hugs and goodbyes, like, hey, we're not playing again, and next thing you know they're in the playoffs. So just kind of it's going to make for a very interesting dynamic for week 9. But hey, we're only in August, so we'll get to that at some point. Looking at some of the other matchups that I see, on a small school level, Hope Academy, I got to do their preview for their conference, for Friday Night Drive and for our magazine. And I really had a great conversation with their coach, Coach Mallett, and he talked about how, we don't duck anybody and we'll play anybody. He mentioned they've gone to California before. I feel like they've been to multiple states. Well, they're not going to California week 1, but they are going to Wilmington. So, but that is one of the matchups, outside of the 8A, 76A brackets that I'm really paying attention to.
Well, this was kind of funny because I'm friends with coaches on both sides of this, and both of these two teams were kind of, once again, they were another teams looking for games and trying to figure out what worked, and I kind of instigated this game, to be completely honest with you. And I think both of these coaches would admit to that. I kind of put them together and said, hey, guys, I think this is an interesting contrast in styles, and it would be a great opportunity for you guys to do what you always do, which is both of those programs historically have not backed away from playing anybody that is willing to play them. So, Hope has been all over the place, playing schools sometimes 4 and 5 times larger than them on a regular basis, with no concern about whether or not they'll be able to compete. And they usually answer the bell. So this is a fun matchup. And Wilmington, as a lot of people that have followed me and what I do for a long time, is one of my favorite football atmospheres in the state. So a fun opportunity for 2 really good quality programs to kick off the season against one another at the small level.
Yeah, Wilmington's got a couple interesting games at the start of the year. They get Hope Academy. Then I know they go to Sandwich in week 2, and Sandwich was a team last year. If people are not familiar, they went from not having football in 2022, 0-9 the year before that they only made the quarterfinals in Class 4A. So a couple really kind of again interesting matchups for Wilmington. I'm quite certain that they're up to the challenge and they'll do just fine. But interesting to see how that's gonna come about. A game that I'm really interested in. I'm actually going to be out there on Saturday. Duchamp Field, for my money, best setting for high school football in Illinois. Yeah, they just bring Batavia to town. Batavia-Glenbard West. They might be the 2 best programs in the western suburbs. I'm not sure about that, but they're definitely in the top, very top echelon. What's your thoughts on that matchup?
Well, this is one that I believe a few years ago, when we went through the whole COVID situation, this game was on the books to be happening back then, and it ended up getting washed away. Because I remember being a little upset about that, because I was like, man, I really want to see that game. And I'm glad to see that we figured out a way to finally get it done. Like you said, a great environment for another great environment for high school football at Glenbard West. It's one that I'm hoping that I'm able to get to as well on Saturday afternoon. Two programs that really have established themselves as kind of the gold standard out in that area of the state. Batavia has kind of bounced back and forth between the 6 and 7A playoffs over recent years. Glenbard West is kind of a 7A, 8A bubble team. But either way, whatever bracket those two teams end up in, they're the kind of team that you don't want to see in the postseason because they tend to put it together. They tend to have that good team chemistry. They also tend to have a couple of top shelf, athletes and competitors that really help you along at that time of year. So a really great non-conference matchup here. But another situation where you look at their schedules and you really kind of have to tip, even if it was out of necessity, you have to kind of tip your cap to those two programs for actually playing this game. Glenbard West was really in a bind, and they're playing a little team. I don't know. Maybe you heard of them too. They have Loyola in week 2 before they enter, a brutal conference schedule in the West Suburban. Batavia, the Duquesne on a year-to-year basis, I think the depth from top to bottom is what really impresses me about that conference. You can finish in the middle of the pack in that conference and still be a really, really good football team. And I think if you run through that league without a loss, you've really accomplished something, because it feels like on a week-to-week basis, there's at least one, maybe 2 games that are just these wild shootouts that come down to the last minute of the game. So, once again, kudos to these two programs for making this game happen. I know in some respects they may not have had a choice in the matter. They simply wanted to find a game. But once again, both of these two teams, after this one's over, whoever wins it, whoever loses it, is going to face a pretty big climb the rest of the way.
I was going to say, you learned about teams from week 1. Well, I tell you what, we're going to learn a few things about Glenbard West the first few weeks when they got Batavia at home, Loyola at home. And, oh, by the way, then they start silver play at Downers Grove North. That was a Class 7A state runner-up last year. So I'm not doubting Glenbard West. I will never doubt Glenbard West. But, boy, that is a load to start the season when you talk about those 3 opponents. Steve, what are some of the other matchups that as we sit here, you're kind of paying attention to as we're 2 days away?
Well, I look at the Hershey-Warren game as an interesting development. Hershey had a really strong season last year. Still has not kind of been able to really climb the postseason hurdle quite yet, but have been churning out some good years year after year. They're going up against a Warren team that I think is flying under the radar a little bit. In the original Friday Night Drive rankings, I have them at number 11. I could easily justify having them a lot higher than that. I feel like they are a team that a lot of people aren't talking about, up by the Wisconsin border, maybe don't draw the attention that they should. But historically, this is a program that puts together some really strong defenses. And when you match that up against a Hershey team that is, over the last couple of years, has not really had much trouble putting points up on the board, I think that provides for an interesting contrast.
Yeah, definitely that. And then we talked about like the Duquesne Conference stepping out and just the depth of that conference. You're seeing in week 1 with the teams that they're playing. Wheaton North has Providence coming there. St. Charles North playing Crete Moni. We mentioned Batavia, Geneva, in week 2, they play Lamont. So, Wheaton Warrenville South plays Glenbard South, which is kind of one of an interesting matchup in that for both sides, in that Glenbard South comes from that Upstate 8, which until this year was that closed league. I'm interested to see how a team like Glenbard South is going to fare, when they play a non-conference game, which they don't get but until this year.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting little wrinkles with that Upstate 8 conference developing, splitting into 2 divisions. 7 on a side leads to the opportunity to play some non-conference games, which is something for the last multiple years Upstate 8 teams have not been able to do. So you never know going into the playoffs whether or not they're correctly battle tested. For years, South Elgin would run the table in that conference, for example, and then they would go into the playoffs and struggle because they hadn't seen the caliber of 8A competition that they needed to be prepared for the season. So, to their credit, South Elgin's response was, let's schedule Barrington in week 1. Let's go out to Batavia in week 2. So, that's a really nice job right there of taking the opportunity to say, hey, maybe our conference hasn't really set us up as well as it could to prepare us for a playoff run. let's go out and test ourselves with the best teams that we're willing to find that need to have those opportunities. So kudos to them. There are several other games in the Upstate 8 as well, where they've taken those non-conference games and used them as an opportunity to say, hey, we think we're going to have a good football team. Let's take those week 1 and 2 games as an opportunity to find out what we need to be where we want to be when November rolls around.
I know before we get out of here, I know we touched on a lot of games around Northern Illinois. Is there a game that's maybe in Central Illinois or south of Route 80 that you're really keeping an eye on Friday?
Well, the one that, I mean, it's not necessarily, in Central or South. The one that really kind of stands out to me is, and I'm looking at it from a small school perspective, Newman Central Catholic travels to Princeton in week 1. Princeton's had been really outstanding for a while, has gotten off to good starts and been a presence in the 3A playoffs. Newman Central Catholic has been Newman Central Catholic, but maybe a little bit of a tiny step back. But that's a game that I look at as kind of a benchmark for what exactly we're going to expect out of those two programs moving forward. Because small school programs, obviously, everybody has turnover from graduation, but sometimes small school programs have a ton. So you might have a lot of turnover in some of those smaller programs where teams almost look completely different. So those are the kinds of games that I look at in terms of what exactly do we have. And another one that kind of intrigues me out there, although it was pretty lopsided last year when they played, I still like to look at that Coal City and Morris game. They're two schools that 4A for Coal City, 4A, 5A for Morris. Morris, I think they lost some key cogs to graduation, but from everything I've heard, I feel like that's a team that is going to be able to do what they typically do in that program, which is reload. So measuring two consistent playoff programs against each other in week 1, it's always something I keep a close eye on, because you like to see where those teams are at right out of the gate.
Yeah, Princeton's an interesting program because, you can say it was small, quote unquote, small town or whatever. They get some big time talent in that program. They had a kid that I believe went on to Iowa. Maybe he was hurt. They now have Noah Laporte, who's going to Northwestern. So, a lot of talent in Princeton. And that is a very interesting matchup, playing Newman Central Catholic right off the bat. So there's a lot of football going on, is what we're trying to say. We have just wanted to kind of bring people up to speed about what we have going on here. We talked about Batavia-Glenbard West. If anybody wants to hear a little bit more about that matchup and others around the western suburbs, I tape a podcast with Joel Bennett's Western Suburbs podcast. JT Peddledy, Eddie Criffio, and Drake Landsman. They have a podcast looking at some of the games in the northwestern Illinois. I'm sure they mentioned Newman Princeton in that one as well. And then we kind of look ahead to Friday night, and Steve, you'll be on with Matt Rodewald from 9:30 to 11, breaking down all the big matchups, kind of figuring out what it all means. We'll have reports from our reporters, coaches, players, what have you. So a lot of excitement in Illinois high school football, and a lot of excitement at FridayNightDrive.com. We're going to be covering something like 40 games on Friday night, as well as Thursday and Saturday. Steve, before we get out of here, any final thoughts?
When you just look at it, just really excited to have football back and just get into a situation where we can start to identify what these teams are all about. Like I said before, there's 493 of them that are trying to figure out what they are on Friday night. And that's all Friday and Saturday, I should say. There are always some great stories that emerge. Maybe not in week 1, but you start to see the signs of some teams that maybe you didn't have great high expectations for, maybe breaking out and showing those. Those are always my favorite stories. The teams that maybe haven't had a ton of success that show some signs that maybe they're about to turn a corner and do some great things. We had several of those stories last year. You mentioned one of them in Sandwich. There were several others that I could list in that scenario. And that's what the season brings. It brings an opportunity to kind of forget about what happened last year. That's all in the past now, to make your own story and create the best season that you possibly can.
No doubt. A lot of great stories yet to be told, and we're looking forward to telling them. Before we get out of here, you can follow me at jwelge96. You can follow the Souce at the Souce. You can follow Friday Night Drive on Twitter or X or whatever you choose to call it at FN Drive. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. Until then, I'm Josh Welge with Steve Soucie. We'll see you Friday night and next week.